Welcome to the next set of modules. We're looking at the brain itself. It's referred to as the consciousness and the two-track mind. I guess one of the first questions I'd pose to you as we get out of the gate with this particular is exactly how would you define consciousness? We have a lot of our words that have within them the word conscious, self-conscious. Somebody who's self-conscious is overwhelmed, sometimes even overconsumed with paying attention to oneself. And in the history of psychology, consciousness was really at the root of where we began. And so essentially the initial definition of psychology was the description and explanation of states of consciousness. That was the primary focal point of psychology as we began to look at human functioning. And then because of how nebulous it is and how individualized it is, we moved more toward behavior rather than consciousness. John B. Watson is famous for the quote to the side there over on the left: psychology must discard all reference to consciousness. Partly because if we were going to be a science, we needed to have objectification of information and validation using the scientific method, and behavior lent itself most effectively to that kind of scientific study, not consciousness, rather than the internal events that oftentimes we refer to as consciousness. And that held sway for quite a while. Obviously, if you remember, I mentioned the fact that it was a reaction to the overabundance of attention that it was placed on consciousness from Freud. So along about after behaviorism won the day for so many years and really spawned much of what we know today about behavior, like operant conditioning and classical conditioning, then before too long, around the 60s, mental concepts reemerged. And it began to be a focus of how we operated internally. And these mental concepts oftentimes were referred to as cognitions. And that has been a good part of what we do even today. Behaviorism is still a very viable force, but today when we actually define consciousness, it is all about awareness, and that's the key, is awareness of ourself and our environment. And when you think about it, of self and environment, when you think about it, that really defines us uniquely. Animals don't really have a sense of self. That's part of what makes us laugh at them, is that they have no sense of self. They'll do stupid tricks. David Letterman, I don't know if he still does it, but he used to have on his show stupid pet tricks. It's funny because they don't get embarrassed, which is really a function of awareness. So the element of self is unique to us. Now, awareness of environment is a very different matter. It exists in a lot of beings and organisms today, not just humans. But the question is how do brain cells interacting with one another create this thing that we call awareness? Something as simple as eating a meal and saying to yourself or saying to the cook, this really, really tastes great. And that's very much a part of that. Now, we have gone so far as to define different kinds of consciousness, states of consciousness. Some happen spontaneously, like daydreaming, spontaneous. Let's put those up here so that you can remember them. Spontaneous. So we can put daydreaming. Happens a lot in classes. Oftentimes by midterm, people are starting to wear out because they're sleep deprived, or they just don't like the class, or the class is so boring that their brains are somewhere else, minds are somewhere else. Straight dreaming, which also is a spontaneous thing that happens as we sleep, and then of course the ever-present drowsiness. Now a lot of that, particularly the drowsiness, the farther into school you go, the more you'll realize that is an indicator of sleep deprivation. Some are physiologically induced, and I'll just put physio up here to suggest it. And physiologically, it can be hallucinations in somebody who is psychotic. They're physiologically produced because of the state that they're in. Another one is sexual orgasm. That state is produced because of the climax of the sexual act, and that in that sense it's physiologically produced. And then finally, which has a fair amount of debate, is the whole idea of hypnosis, which we're probably not going to get into a lot of discussion of, but it is something worth considering. The last one to highlight for you, which is in your book, and I put it in here because I want you to emphasize or have examples in your head about what these might be. But what this young lady is doing is meditation. Even in a lot of times we create images or stereotypes in our head of meditation as being like part of Buddhism, for example. And for us, oftentimes meditation can come as we pray, and also creates a other state another state of consciousness. Of course, sensory deprivation, interestingly enough, that we can actually, in a sense, create, if you will, a sensory deprivation situation. We could actually float somebody in a pool of water exactly the same temperature as their body temperature, and remove all visual input by putting glasses that diffuses light so they don't have anything to focus on. And before too long, interestingly enough, this sensory deprivation begins to look like a hallucination because the brain is deprived of information coming in, so it creates its own. And then, of course, in this sense, hypnosis, which I mentioned earlier, which also fits in the psychological realm, if you will. So these are a few examples, and they're all part of what we refer to as altered states of consciousness. And when we say that, we're being very specific. We're not talking about something that is just a euphemism or a pop psychology kind of thing. Now, let's take a look at cognitive neuroscience next, because that's our attempt to really look into the inner reaches of what goes on in the brain itself. All right, cognitive neuroscience is a fascinating area within psychology because it kind of is doing a peeping Tom kind of thing into what's going on in our brain as we experience life and experience the environment and experience even ourselves. And what you see here, right in this diagram, remember we talked about a PET scan. And this is a good example of it, because what lights up in each of these volunteers and this patient are areas of activity, which means that glucose is being burned and being used, because glucose is the fuel of neurons and nerve cells. And so essentially when we talk about cognitive neuroscience, it's this interdisciplinary study of brain activity linked with our mental processes. So we look at the two things that happen at the same time and begin to make some conclusions about what exactly is happening. Now, we can reduce it down to the neuron activities. We actually have sensors so small that they can go right in and listen in to the neural activity. But exactly, it's not as if we've decoded that neural activity. So what's interesting about this, and why this is so important up here, is the whole idea of what happens when we think, when we are considering things. And so when we actually try to define conscious experience, it really ends up being the kind of thing, as is demonstrated by this picture, is that it is a synchronized activity. Synchronized activity that happens across the brain. It doesn't happen in specific centers. It happens in a number of different places. And we look at this a little bit more in detail when we talk about cognitive psych, or it's Psych 303. It's the same. It's the course that I teach in the fall of every year, and it's cognitive psychology. We look at the mental activities that are going on, and in this case, we can look in on the activity that happens. What's interesting about this particular example is this is a patient who is paralyzed, and not only that, is vegetative. And so we've got a vegetative patient in a coma, a vegetative patient that we might prompt, or even a person who's paralyzed, we might prompt them to say, all right, what I want you to do is imagine for a moment that you're playing tennis. And what you see in this person, even though they're not moving, is we see this activity in the parietal area and the motor cortex and so forth that lights up as they're playing tennis. When we do this with the same people in terms of healthy volunteers, and we ask them to equally imagine the playing tennis, healthy volunteer, we get a very similar pattern of activity in the brain. So essentially, whether somebody can actually do the activity, this person can't, this person can, we still see the same kind of activity in the brain. The same thing is true of navigating one's home. Essentially, we can ask a healthy volunteer, I'll tell you what, why don't you walk me through your home? And, you know, if you've been in your dorm room enough, if I were to say, walk home and talk me through it, various parts of your brain would light up as you're actually, in a sense, making that walk in your head. Even with a patient that is asked to navigate one's home space, just like they did, that's what they mean by spatial navigation. The healthy volunteer activity, looks very similar to the activity that's in somebody who is in a vegetative state. In other words, they aren't able really to do much more than respond with this activity. So the key here is that even though we may not be actually doing anything. So there's no overt behavior. There is still covert activity in the brain. And that's exactly what cognitive neuroscience has allowed us to look into, literally. It's not like a telescope, it's more like a microscope into what's happening in the brain.